Hey everybody, this is Alex Merced from alexmerced.com with Business Cycles 101. If you enjoyed this video and you've enjoyed my other 101 videos, please do subscribe to social media, so Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, you name it, I'm there. But also become a supporter, because through support, I can do more of this, larger scale, better quality. You can become a supporter by going to patreon.com/alexmerced. For as little as $1 a month, you can become a supporter, get access to the Discord group. Also, you can do one-time donations, buy books, buy t-shirts over there at donate.alexmerced.com. So become a supporter. Trust me, I'm putting the money to good use. I'm putting in a lot of effort to do what I can to spread the message, educate, mobilize, encourage others in more knowledge, more liberty. But what I want to talk about today is business cycles. Now, business cycle theories have existed for a long time. The idea is everyone wants to explain why the economy goes up and down. In general, what you see in common with a lot of these theories is always some sort of institutional strength, institutions weakening over time. Now, a lot of the early theories, one of the earliest business cycle theories was by Stanley Jevons, there was basically three names that were sort of associated with what's called the marginal revolution. Sort of three different economists kind of at the same time discovering the idea of marginal utility. And that was Carl Menger, Stanley Jevons, and Leon Walras. But Stanley Jevons had this theory, which he referred to as the sunspot theory. The idea was that based on where the sun is, that's going to affect crop yields. And then, so basically, if crop yields are good, food's going to be cheaper, which means you're going to have more disposable income, so the economy is going to be better. That's the boom. But if crop yields are bad, food's going to be more expensive, so you're going to have less disposable income, so you're going to end up having an economic slump, because now you have less money to spend on everything else. Which gets at, I think, a more fundamental truth in the sense that if your cost of living goes up, it crowds out all the leisure spending. And generally the growth does oftentimes come from leisure, in a sense. So the more you crowd out disposable income, the more it does have sort of an economic consequence. So I think there's some greater truth to that, not necessarily specifically the sun, because also people like Henry George talked about the same thing with like housing. Where, if the cost of housing and goes up, it crowds out your disposable income. That causes a recession. And, you go through these cycles of, housing developments becoming cheaper and vice versa. So there were several theories that kind of looked at different aspects of the cost of living and basically just kind of said that as the cost of living goes up, your disposable income shrinks and vice versa, and then that kind of explains the sort of the fluctuations in the business cycle. Then there is the Keynesian theory of the business cycle, which basically, one way to explain the way Keynes looked at it is that they looked at it as, and there's this big debate between people who are called real business cycle theory and Keynesians, which the idea of there's a shock to the economy. The question is it endogenous or exogenous? So if I remember correctly, endogenous meaning internal, exogenous meaning external. So Keynesians, a lot of Keynesians, I would say, believe that these... Okay, so that's the story with... So you have endogenous versus exogenous. Endogenous would just mean that the shock to the economy came oftentimes because of bad internal policies because of government. So a lot of Keynesians would sit there and say, hey, the high taxes of the 1920s caused excess speculation. And while, not the high taxes, the low taxes of the 1920s caused excess speculation. And while I totally disagree with that, that's not necessarily the point I really want to make in this particular recording, or what I'm trying to get at right now. But they say, okay, that would cause excess speculation, which causes the bubble in 1929. So you had the shock to the economy that was caused by something internal. So what you need to do is fix that policy, aka raise taxes. But at the same time, the shock to the economy has caused everyone to become very sad. This is the whole idea of animal spirits. And because everyone's now sort of pessimistic, they're spending less than they otherwise would, causing sort of a spiraling economy going down. So in that case, we need to sort of reverse that pessimism by stimulative spending. So this is the government, first they can do it by lowering rates. So the Federal Reserve would lower rates. But eventually you might hit the zero bound. At this point, this is where, like Keynes would talk about pushing on a string. You can only push monetary policy so far. So at this point, then the government has to go in there and proactively spend to get enough people feeling more optimistic enough that the momentum sort of moves in the opposite direction. And it's not that Keynes didn't think that the economy could essentially find a new equilibrium. His fear was that the new equilibrium would be worse than the old equilibrium. So in that case, the government should be involved to sort of make sure that the existing and possibly a better equilibrium is discovered on the other end, on the other side. So then what happens? So that's sort of the Keynesian view of the business cycle. So again, something endogenous goes in. It's generally some sort of policy problem. You fix the policy problem, but at the same time, you need to stimulate the economy to recover it. Then there's real business cycle theory. Real business cycle theory generally takes a look at it as an exogenous factor, meaning something from the outside. So you don't necessarily need to fix something policy-wise internally, just keep policy. So generally, a lot of real business cycle theory are sort of less government types, but they still believe in sort of stimulative spending. The idea is like, okay, you don't need to, you can have lower taxes, low regulation internally, but sometimes maybe technological innovation, globalization, other external factors are just going to cause a shock to the economy and make it slump at certain points. And yeah, you maybe want to do some stimulative spending, but you don't necessarily need to change the fundamental sort of policy nature. So you can still generally have a free trade policy, low tax policy. It's just when these shocks happen, you should push against it with proactive sort of injections in the economy, whether through monetary policy or through fiscal policy. Okay, not everyone, and again, these prescriptions as far as what the solution are can differ between a lot of different economists within those camps, outside those camps. So I'm not going to sit there and say, hey, this is how everyone thinks about these things universally. But these are just sort of many of the narratives you'll hear from different economists. So again, there's sort of that whole cost of living cycle whether it's housing, the Sun from Stanley Jevons, or housing from Henry George. There's the Keynesian theory where basically an internal shock causes a slump that needs proactive policy, or real business cycle where an exogenous shock causes the slump and you still got to respond to it. Then there's monetarism, which doesn't even necessarily look at the why. It just looks at what is happening. So if you're familiar with the equation of exchange, MV equals PQ, what does that mean? MV means money times velocity, so basically the amount of money times the amount of times it was spent, equals the price of all goods and services times the number of those goods and services that were bought. Basically, the idea is that everything was purchased with money, so the amount of money and the times it was spent should equal the amount of the stuff that was bought. Just has to. So in that case, if GDP is technically measured, if the economy is looked at as the price of all output, meaning the price of everything that was sold, because every time someone spends money, somebody else makes money theoretically, and there's flaws in this logic, but again, not my point today, just trying to explain the logic. So every dollar that is spent is a dollar of income for somebody else. So that means if GDP is slowing down or declining, okay, that means the price of all the goods sold has gone down, but that also means either the money supply has gone down or the velocity has gone down. So if people are spending money less frequently, the velocity of money is going down. Well, you can't really control how fast people spend money, but you can control the amount of money. So in order to make up the difference in GDP and the slow growth of the GDP, you have to increase the money supply to offset the velocity of the money. And basically that's how you would respond to the recession, which mathematically that works, because technically if you're mathematically measuring recessions by how GDP behaves and you manufacture GDP to be back on an upward slope, you would mathematically have cured the recession. This ignores a lot of like what's going on in the real economy, like are people better off? Are they worse off? Is the division of labor being tampered with in a way that causes long-term structural problems? It begs a lot of questions, but mathematically that holds up. MV equals PQ. But that's sort of the monetarist point of view. When you look at Milton Friedman, the idea was there's a decline in the money supply. That's the recession. So you got to bring it back up if you want to end the recession. Then there's the Austrian business cycle theory, which questions the whole idea: why would you just want to preemptively end the recession? Why the recession is a phenomenon for a reason. It's everyone else is looking at it as, hey, look, there's good times and then bad times happen, and I need to just stop the bad times, without questioning why the bad times are happening. Or kind of like you get sick. Why are you sick? Because something's going wrong in your body, and your body's trying to repair it. You don't want to just shut down those body functions because you don't like them. And I mean, this gets at a much greater fundamental debate on whether the economy is mechanical, which means it can be designed and pieces can be replaced and whatnot, versus being organic, where basically everything sort of has a natural relationship to each other. And when you start messing with stuff, things naturally try to readapt and readjust, and causes all sorts of frictions. So, is it more like a body, or is it more like a car? But not the point of today's video or audio, depending on how you listen to this. So Austrian business cycle theory focuses on the idea that individuals make decisions, because they do. And individuals make decisions based on the information that they have, whether it's their own preferences and the information they have on how to best meet those preferences, prices, knowledge, etc. Now, one of the most fundamental prices in all of the society that affects almost every decision is interest rates. Especially the more society pays for things through financing, the more that interest rate matters and affects the economy as a whole. But it also affects a lot of the allocations of capital and where you allocate it and whatnot. So what the Austrian business cycle theory is saying is that if there's some sort of artificial lowering of the interest rate, so if the government tampers and forces loans to be at a lower rate than what natural supply and demand would dictate the natural rate of interest to be, that there's going to be a distortion between the allocations of capital relative to actual preferences of society. It doesn't necessarily mean people are going to invest more or less. This is not a over-investment or under-investment story. This is a mal-investment story. It's not that people invest more or less, but they invest differently. Because based on the interest rate, different projects will look viable relative to others. So generally what happens with lower interest rates, certain projects will suddenly look a lot more profitable than they otherwise would have been. Some projects will look so profitable that everyone thinks it's a good idea to borrow the money cheaply to invest in that particular project at the same time. Okay? And what this results in is that everyone's sort of grasping. So let me use like a practical example. Like right after 2008, interest rates were lowered. Oil was really high in price. So you had cheap money. I could borrow the money really cheap, develop an oil well, and that oil well, I could sell that oil at a much higher price because of the low relative to my financing costs. So it looked very profitable. But this suddenly makes sense to a lot of different entrepreneurs who are like, hey, I can borrow money cheap, drill oil, sell it at a really high price, make a nice profit. But then what happens if everyone gets the same idea at the same time? They're all buying the same capital goods. They're all buying the same types of machinery to go drill for that oil. This drives up the cost of those capital goods because they're all buying them at the same time. And what happens eventually, it turns out that the costs for a lot of these producers to finish that well at the end of the day ended up being much higher than expected, because as they drove up the capital goods, they had to pay those higher costs. On top of that, since all of them are sort of bringing new oil to the market at the same time, the oil price went down by a lot. So then what happened is that project was no longer as profitable as it seemed to be in the beginning, when you expected that you would have lower capital costs and a higher sale price, because the lower interest rate made that project seem viable to too many people, and made other projects seem not viable enough, because technically what's happening. It's not that there's overinvestment in oil. You could say that, sort of. Doesn't necessarily have to be the case, but because of all the because there was more investment in oil, there was less investment somewhere else, because some other project probably would have made more sense if the rate. So you have all this, you have too much here and not enough there. So it's again not an overinvestment story; it's a malinvestment story. It's just everything's kind of put in the wrong place. So some of those oil companies are not going to survive. They're going to go out of business, which means that they're going to go out of business, which means all the jobs that they created are gone. And then a lot of their suppliers who made those capital goods, they're not going to be in demand as much anymore, so they're going to see slumps in their factory. So all those people who worked at that factory, who worked on that oil rig, they bought stuff from different vendors, and those vendors are going to lose their customers, and they're going to suffer. So basically, you end up having this sort of retracement of the economy from that happens. And basically, there has to be a liquidation, which can happen. So basically, some of those oil companies, while they fail, they may still be able to be sold at a discount to somebody else. So that company will go out of business. But it doesn't necessarily mean it has to stop selling that oil. What it'll do is you'll have to sell it to somebody else at a much lower price where it is profitable to the new owner. So the old owner who borrowed all this capital walks away with a lot less than they started with when everything's said and done. And so do the banks that lent them the money, and the people who put money in those banks, they all took a loss. But that oil company will move into new hands who purchase it in liquidation at a lower price, and now there will be a profitable margin there again. That's why you want to let the liquidation occur. So that way all these projects can move into hands whose cost structure suddenly make those projects viable again, so that way the economy can begin moving forward. What happens is that oftentimes the governments intervene and prevent the liquidation. They prevent the bust. So then what happens is that those projects stay in the hands of people whose cost structure, whose debts, make it impossible to have those structures those projects profitable. So they kind of stagnate, and they kind of stuck where they're at because capital can't move forward because they're just trying to maintain this heavy structure that was created during the boom. So that's sort of a very, very detailed explanation with some editorial on my own part as far as how the Austrian business cycle theory works. I mean, if you want to look at it in an even simpler way, you can think of it as like a lottery winner. So a lottery winner wins a whole bunch of money, and they're going to put the money in a lot of wrong places because it's just too much. At the same time, there's information and knowledge that happens when you earn money, so you know how to allocate it well. In this case, it's a surge of money in the money supply, which causes lower interest rates, and it's kind of like the economy winning the lottery. There's a boom, but then a few years later, you have the bust, in the same way that the lottery winner kind of ends up in a worse position than they were a few years later. That's the Austrian theory of the business cycle. The big difference between this one, again, it's taking a look at the bust as a sort of... Basically, the problem was that during the boom, we were putting everything in the wrong places. We were building the puzzle wrong. We were confusing where all the pieces belong. So the bust is actually the solution, is us taking away all the wrong pieces from the wrong spots so that way we can put them back. The idea is that you can't just build and continue building a puzzle on top of pieces that were wrong, put in the wrong place. You got to move backwards to move forwards. That's what makes the Austrian business cycle theory very different than the other ones, who will just look at it as, hey, something bad happened, do whatever you can to stop it from happening. And hopefully you guys found this interesting. My name's Alex Merced from alexmerced.com. Please become a supporter by going to donate.alexmerced.com or patreon.com/alexmerced. Have a great day and enjoy.